The ballroom of the Ashcroft Hotel glowed with gold light and the sound of clinking champagne glasses. 200 guests filled the room, dressed in silk and tailored suits, all gathered to celebrate the engagement of Marcus Whitfield and his bride-to-be, Elena Cross. Grayson Hale stood near the back wall, a drink in his hand that he had barely touched. He wasn't here to celebrate. He was here because Marcus's father ran 3 shipping companies that quietly moved goods for Grayson's organization, and skipping the party would have raised questions he didn't want asked. He scanned the room the way he scanned every room, out of habit more than interest. Then he saw her. Brielle stood near the dessert table, wearing a deep green dress that suited her perfectly. She wasn't trying to hide in the corner the way some people expected a woman her size to do at events like this. She stood tall, laughed easily with the people around her, and carried herself like she belonged exactly where she was standing. Grayson had noticed her before. Over a year ago, actually, at a charity gala where she had organized everything down to the smallest detail while somehow making it look effortless. He remembered how she had crouched down to talk to a nervous little girl who'd spilled juice on her dress, calming her down in seconds. He remembered thinking that a woman like that didn't belong anywhere near his world. So he had kept his distance, a polite nod here, a brief hello there, nothing more. He told himself it was for her own good. Tonight, he watched her walk toward the happy couple, a small velvet box in her hand. A gift, he assumed. She reached Marcus and Elena and said something with a warm smile. Grayson couldn't hear the words from where he stood, but he could see Brielle's face soften into something private and a little sad. He would learn later what she'd said, that years ago, before Marcus met Elena, before any of this, Brielle had cared about him. Not obsessively, not dramatically, just a quiet crush that had lingered longer than she wanted it to. She'd decided tonight was the night to finally let it go, to say it out loud so it would stop living silently in the back of her mind. She wanted to wish him well, and mean it completely. It should have ended there. A moment of honesty, a warm handshake, maybe a laugh about old times. Instead, Marcus turned to the small crowd standing near him and laughed. Loud, sharp, the kind of laugh meant to be heard. "Did you hear that?" he said, loud enough for a dozen people to turn their heads. "She's telling me she used to like me." He shook his head, grinning at his friends like he'd just been told a joke. "I'd rather die than marry her." The words landed like a slap. For a second, nobody moved. Then came the laughter. Not everyone, but enough. A ripple of chuckles spread from one cluster of guests to another, the kind of laughter people give when they don't want to be the one who stays silent. Brielle stood frozen, the velvet box still in her hand. Her face went pale, then red. She opened her mouth like she wanted to say something, but nothing came out. The music kept playing, the chandeliers kept glowing, and she stood there, exposed in front of 200 strangers who now knew something she never meant to make public. Across the room, Grayson's jaw tightened. His grip on his glass didn't change. His expression didn't shift much. But something inside him went cold and sharp all at once. He had spent years learning to read rooms, to sense danger before it arrived. What he felt now wasn't danger. It was something closer to fury, quiet and controlled, the kind that didn't need to shout to be felt. He took one step forward, some instinct pulling him toward her. Then he stopped himself. This wasn't his moment to fix. Not yet. Not like this. Brielle recovered just enough to force a small, tight smile. The kind people wear when they're trying to convince a room they're fine. She set the velvet box down on the gift table without a word, turned, and walked toward the exit. She didn't run, she didn't cry, not there. She simply left, weaving through the crowd with her chin slightly raised, refusing to give anyone the satisfaction of watching her fall apart. Grayson watched her go. He watched the doors close behind her, watched the party continue as if nothing had happened, watched Marcus laugh again with his friends like he'd already forgotten what he'd said. Something settled in Grayson's chest that night, quiet but absolute. He didn't know her well. He'd never spoken more than a few sentences to her in his life. But he knew, standing there in that ballroom full of people who had already moved on, that he could not simply walk away and pretend he hadn't seen what happened. He finished his drink, set the glass down on a passing tray, and left the party early, his mind already working through a plan he hadn't fully admitted to himself yet. Whatever line he had drawn between his world and hers, whatever reasons he'd given himself for staying away, none of it mattered anymore, not after tonight. He just didn't know yet how far he was willing to go to make things right. By morning, Brielle had already canceled 3 meetings and turned her phone to silent. She sat at her kitchen counter in her Manhattan apartment, staring at a cup of coffee that had gone cold an hour ago. Her assistant had texted twice, asking about the Hendricks wedding walkthrough. A client wanted to confirm flower arrangements for a corporate dinner. None of it felt like it mattered. She kept replaying the sound of that laughter, not Marcus's voice, though that stung too, but the ripple of chuckles from people she didn't even know. Strangers finding her humiliation entertaining for a few seconds before moving on to the next glass of champagne. By noon, she had emailed every client on her calendar for the next 2 weeks, telling them a family matter required her attention. It wasn't a complete lie. Her grandmother's cottage counted as family, even if her grandmother had passed 3 years earlier. She packed a single bag, left her apartment key with her downstairs neighbor to water her plants, and drove 2 hours north into Connecticut without telling anyone where she was going. The gossip about the engagement party moved fast and disappeared just as quickly. A few group chats mentioned it. A couple of guests posted vague comments online without naming names. By the following week, most people had already forgotten the specifics, distracted by newer scandals and fresher stories. Grayson hadn't forgotten. He sat in his office on the 40th floor, staring at a stack of contracts he couldn't focus on. His assistant, Marcus Delaney, no relation to the groom, had learned over the years to recognize when his boss was somewhere else entirely, even while sitting perfectly still. "You've read the same page 4 times, Delaney said, setting down a folder. "Have I?" "You have." Delaney studied him for a moment. "This about the party?" Grayson didn't answer, which was answer enough. He wasn't a man who chased people down or used his resources to track someone for personal reasons. He'd built his reputation on restraint, on doing things quietly and efficiently, never drawing more attention than necessary. But this felt different, and he didn't like not understanding why. He asked Delaney to look into it, carefully and without alarming anyone. Nothing invasive, no surveillance, no pressure on her friends or family, just simple, public information, where she might have gone, whether she was safe. It took less than a day. Brielle Anders had grown up spending summers at her grandmother's lakeside cottage in a small Connecticut town called Millbrook. Public records showed the property still belonged to her, inherited after her grandmother's death. It wasn't hard to guess where a person would go when they wanted to disappear from the world for a while. Grayson didn't drive out there himself. He didn't call her, didn't send flowers, didn't do any of the things a man in his position might have done to insert himself into her life. Instead, he thought of Eleanor Voss, an elderly widow who had lived near the lake for decades and who happened to know his late mother from years before his family's business had grown into what it was now. Eleanor was sharp, kind, and utterly unconnected to anything dangerous. She ran the local flower shop and knew everyone in Millbrook by name. He called her directly, something he rarely did with anyone outside his organization. "Grayson Hale," Eleanor said when she picked up, surprise evident in her voice. "It's been years." "I need a favor, Eleanor. Nothing complicated." He explained only what was necessary. A young woman named Brielle was staying at her grandmother's cottage near the lake, likely going through a difficult time. He didn't want anyone approached or questioned. He simply wanted to know, quietly, that she was doing all right. Nothing more. Eleanor agreed without asking too many questions, the kind of easy trust that came from decades of knowing a family. Brielle spent her first few days at the cottage doing very little. She woke early, sat on the small dock behind the house, and watched the mist lift off the water while she drank tea her grandmother used to make. The cottage still smelled faintly of cedar and old books, and being there made her feel like a child again, before other things had become things she had to worry about. She didn't check her phone much. When she did, she saw the same messages piling up, none of them urgent enough to pull her back to the city. For the first time in years, she let herself simply exist without a schedule dictating every hour of her day. On her fourth morning, she walked into town for groceries and stopped by the small flower shop near the square, drawn in by the smell of fresh lilies through the open door. Eleanor greeted her warmly, asked about her grandmother's garden, and mentioned, almost in passing, how nice it was that Brielle had come back to Millbrook after so long. Brielle smiled, thanked her, and left with a small bundle of flowers for the cottage table. She didn't think anything of the conversation. She had no reason to suspect that somewhere in Manhattan, a man she barely knew had quietly made sure someone was watching over her, not out of obsession, but out of a concern he hadn't yet let himself fully understand. By the end of the week, the color had started returning to her face. She laughed at something on the radio while making dinner. She sat outside longer, watching the sunset without checking the time. She had no idea her old life and her new peace were about to collide again, sooner than she expected, in the most ordinary of places. Grayson told himself the trip to Millbrook was purely business. He owned a small logistics warehouse 20 minutes outside the town, one of dozens scattered across the state, and it genuinely needed a walkthrough after a manager's complaint about faulty wiring. That much was true. What he didn't admit, even to himself until he was already in the car, was that he'd chosen this particular week to handle it in person, instead of sending someone else. Saturday morning brought clear skies and a light breeze off the lake. After finishing at the warehouse earlier than expected, Grayson found himself driving through the center of Millbrook instead of heading straight back to the highway. The town square was busier than usual, filled with striped tents, wooden crates of produce, and the sound of a local band tuning their instruments near the gazebo. He told himself he only wanted coffee. Brielle had come to the farmer's market for the same reason she went most Saturdays now. It gave her a reason to leave the cottage, talk to people who had no idea who she was or what had happened at that party, and remind herself that life outside Manhattan still existed. She wandered between a stand selling honey and one selling handmade soap, chatting easily with the vendors, most of whom recognized her as the granddaughter of the woman who used to run the community garden decades earlier. She was examining a table of hand-thrown pottery when a familiar voice caught her off guard. "These are well made." She turned and found Grayson standing beside her, holding a small ceramic bowl painted with a pattern of blue leaves. For a moment, neither of them said anything. Brielle's mind raced back instantly to the ballroom, to the humiliation still fresh enough to sting, and she braced herself for pity or awkward sympathy. Neither came. "Mr. Hale," she said carefully, "I didn't expect to see you out here." "Neither did I, honestly." He set the bowl down gently. "I had a business matter nearby. Didn't realize the town had something like this going on." Something in his tone felt easy, unbothered, nothing like the tension she expected from someone who had witnessed her worst moment weeks earlier. She relaxed slightly, curiosity replacing her guard. "It happens every Saturday during the warmer months," she said. My grandmother used to bring me here when I was young. I forgot how much I missed it." They fell into conversation naturally, drifting from one stall to another without either of them planning it. Grayson asked about the honey vendor's beekeeping process, genuinely interested rather than making polite small talk. Brielle found herself explaining local traditions she hadn't thought about in years, surprised at how easily the words came. At a table selling handmade scarves, Brielle picked up a deep red one and held it up against the light. "My grandmother would have loved this color," she said softly. "She sounds like she had good taste," Grayson replied. "She did. She's the reason I got into event planning, actually. She used to organize the whole town's summer festival every year. I helped her from the time I could walk, practically." Brielle laughed a little at the memory. "I think I inherited her stubbornness more than her patience, though." Grayson smiled, an expression that looked unfamiliar on his face, like a muscle he didn't use often. Stubbornness has its uses. They walked for nearly an hour, talking about nothing important and everything comfortable. Neither mentioned Manhattan. Neither mentioned the party, the humiliation, or the reason Brielle had disappeared from her usual life. It was as if an unspoken agreement passed between them the moment they started talking, one that said this conversation belonged only to the present. Brielle noticed things about him she hadn't expected. He listened fully when she spoke, without glancing at his phone or looking past her shoulder for someone more important to talk to. He asked follow-up questions instead of simply nodding along. For a man rumored to run one of the most powerful business empires in the state, he seemed remarkably unhurried. As the market began winding down and vendors started packing away unsold goods, Grayson walked her toward the edge of the square where her car was parked. "There's a cafe a few streets over," he said. "Corner of Elm and Bridge. Good coffee, quiet in the mornings. Might be worth checking out if you're staying in town a while longer." "Have you been?" she asked, curious. "Once, years ago." He didn't explain further, and she didn't push. "I'll keep it in mind," she said, smiling. "Thank you, Mr. Hale." "Grayson is fine." "Grayson, then." The name felt strange but not unwelcome on her tongue. They said their goodbyes with nothing more than a simple nod, and Grayson watched her drive off before returning to his own car. He sat there a moment longer than necessary, replaying the conversation in his mind, surprised by how effortless it had felt. He hadn't planned what to say to her, hadn't rehearsed any version of this meeting the way he usually prepared for important conversations. It had simply happened, and it had felt right. Brielle drove back toward the cottage with the windows down, humming along to whatever played on the radio. She caught herself smiling for no particular reason and realized it was the first time in weeks she'd felt entirely like herself again, unweighted by embarrassment or the memory of laughter that wasn't kind. She assumed the meeting had been a simple coincidence, two people crossing paths in a small town neither expected to run into anyone familiar in. She had no reason to think otherwise. Grayson had said nothing to suggest he'd known where she was staying, nothing that hinted at anything beyond good timing and shared curiosity about the local market. What she didn't know was that this wouldn't be the last unplanned meeting between them that week, and that Grayson had every intention of finding a reason to be nearby again before she returned to New York. The bookstore in Millbrook sat tucked between a hardware store and a bakery, its window display crowded with worn paperbacks and a hand-painted sign that hadn't been updated in years. Brielle wandered in on a rainy Tuesday afternoon, looking for something to read that had nothing to do with event planning or wedding magazines. She was flipping through a collection of short stories when a voice behind her made her pause. "That one's better than people give it credit for." She turned to find Grayson standing a few feet away, a hardcover tucked under his arm. She raised an eyebrow, surprised but not as startled as she'd been at the farmer's market. "Following me now?" she asked, half joking. "Small town," he said simply. "Hard not to run into the same people twice." She let it go, though a small part of her wondered about the odds. They ended up spending nearly 2 hours in the store, moving between shelves, arguing lightly about which classic novels were overrated and which underrated ones deserved more attention. Brielle discovered he'd read far more than she expected from someone who spent his days running companies, and, according to rumors she tried not to think about, considerably more than that. "You don't strike me as a reader," she admitted as they walked out, both empty-handed since neither had actually bought anything. "Everyone assumes that," he said. "Makes for good cover, actually. Nobody expects the man they're afraid of to be sitting home with a book." She laughed at that, and it was the first time she noticed how rarely she'd laughed since the engagement party. It came easier around him than she expected. 3 days later, they crossed paths again at the botanical garden on the edge of town, an old estate converted into public grounds decades earlier. Brielle had gone to scout the location for a potential summer wedding, one of the few work commitments she hadn't fully abandoned. Grayson claimed he was meeting a supplier nearby and decided to walk the grounds while waiting. Neither of them questioned the coincidence out loud, though Brielle found herself wondering, just briefly, whether Millbrook truly was small enough for this many chance encounters. They walked through the rose garden together, Brielle pointing out which flowers would photograph well for a ceremony and which wouldn't survive the summer heat. Grayson listened with the same attentiveness he'd shown at the market, asking questions that weren't just polite filler. "You really care about this," he observed, watching her crouch down to examine a cluster of peonies. "It's the only thing I've ever been good at," she said, "making moments feel special for other people." "That's not a small thing." She glanced up at him, something in his tone catching her off guard. Most people treated her career as a hobby dressed up as a job, something charming but not particularly serious. He said it like he actually believed it. By the following weekend, Brielle had returned to a lakeside charity fundraiser she used to help organize before she'd stopped attending community events during her time away from Millbrook. She hadn't expected to see Grayson there, listed among the evening's sponsors, but she wasn't entirely surprised either. He kept his distance during most of the event, mingling politely with other donors, never making a show of knowing her beyond a brief, friendly nod when their paths crossed near the dessert table. It was a small gesture, but she noticed it. He never used these moments to draw attention to whatever was forming between them, never treated her differently in front of others than he did when they were alone. Later that night, back at his office in Manhattan, Grayson sat across from Delaney, reviewing quarterly reports that Grayson kept losing focus on. "You've been in a better mood," Delaney said eventually, setting his pen down. "Haven't seen you like this in years, honestly." "I don't know what you mean." "Sure you don't." Delaney allowed himself a small, knowing smile. "Millbrook agrees with you." Grayson didn't confirm or deny it, but he didn't argue either. Delaney had worked alongside him long enough to recognize the shift, subtle as it was. Fewer late nights spent brooding over old grievances, a little more patience with people who usually tested it. Delaney respected his boss enough not to push further, choosing instead to let whatever was happening unfold on its own terms. Back in Millbrook, Brielle found herself thinking about Grayson more often than she wanted to admit. She caught herself replaying small details from their conversations, the way he remembered things she'd mentioned only once, the way he never made her feel like her size or her past humiliation mattered to him at all. She mentioned him briefly to her friend Naomi over the phone one evening, careful to keep her tone casual. "He's just easy to talk to," she said. "Doesn't try to impress me or anything, just listens." "Sounds like more than just easy conversation to me," Naomi teased. "It's not like that," Brielle insisted, though even she wasn't entirely convinced by her own words. She sat on the dock that evening, long after the sun had set, staring out at the dark water while turning the same question over in her mind. Someone as successful, as guarded, as seemingly untouchable as Grayson Hale had no obvious reason to keep showing interest in someone he barely knew, someone whose life had recently become the subject of humiliating gossip. Yet every time their paths crossed, he treated her like her opinions mattered, like her presence added something valuable to whatever room they happened to share. She didn't have an answer for why, not yet. But she found herself looking forward to finding out, even as a small, cautious part of her mind wondered what exactly a man like Grayson Hale wanted from someone like her. 2 weeks into her time in Millbrook, Brielle received a call that made her sit up straighter than she had in a while. It was Diane Coker, a longtime client who ran one of the city's largest philanthropic foundations, asking if Brielle would take on the foundation's annual fundraising gala that year. The event was one of the most talked-about nights on the city's social calendar, drawing business leaders, minor celebrities, and enough donors to fund a small hospital wing in a single evening. "I know you've stepped back lately," Diane said carefully, clearly aware of the rumors that had circulated after the engagement party. "But you're the best in the city at this, and I need the best." Brielle stared out at the lake through her grandmother's kitchen window, turning the offer over in her mind. Part of her wanted to stay hidden a little longer, to keep enjoying the quiet peace she'd built for herself away from prying eyes. But a larger part of her, one that had been growing stronger over these past weeks, refused to let one humiliating night keep dictating the shape of her future. "I'll do it," she said before she could talk herself out of it. She packed her things the following day, said goodbye to Eleanor at the flower shop, and drove back to Manhattan with a mixture of nerves and determination sitting heavily in her chest. The gala planning meetings began almost immediately, held in a conference room overlooking Central Park. Brielle arrived early to the first one, notebook in hand, ready to prove to herself as much as anyone else that she hadn't lost her edge. She wasn't expecting Grayson to walk in 20 minutes later, seated among a handful of major sponsors funding the evening. Their eyes met briefly across the room. Neither acknowledged their growing friendship beyond a polite, professional nod, the same one he might have given any other sponsor in the room. Brielle appreciated it more than she expected. She'd worried, somewhere in the back of her mind during the drive to the city, that seeing him again in this context might feel awkward or complicated. Instead, it felt oddly steadying, like having one familiar face in an otherwise unfamiliar room. "Mr. Hale," she said during introductions, keeping her tone even. "Ms. Anders," he replied, matching her formality with the faintest hint of amusement in his eyes. The meeting proceeded like any other. Brielle outlined her vision for the evening, a theme built around highlighting the foundation's work in underserved communities, rather than simply showcasing wealth for its own sake. Several sponsors nodded along politely, clearly more interested in seeing their names on the program than in the actual cause. Grayson asked pointed questions about how the funds would be allocated, questions that showed he'd actually read the foundation's reports beforehand. Brielle found herself answering him more thoroughly than she answered anyone else in the room. Not because she favored him, but because his questions actually deserved real answers. Over the following weeks, their paths crossed constantly as gala preparations picked up speed. Grayson attended every planning session, always engaged, never treating Brielle differently from any other professional in the room. He didn't flirt, didn't single her out, didn't do anything that might draw unwanted attention or gossip toward either of them. If anything, his consistency was what struck her most. He was exactly the same person in this glass conference room that he'd been at the farmer's market, the bookstore, and the botanical garden. One evening, after a particularly long session that ran well past dinner time, most of the team had already left the building. Brielle stayed behind to finalize seating charts, and Grayson lingered near the door, apparently reviewing something on his phone. "You don't have to wait around," she said without looking up from her laptop. "I know." She glanced up, catching the faint smile on his face. "Then why are you still here?" "Figured you shouldn't be walking to your car alone this late," he said simply. "Nothing more complicated than that." She wanted to point out that Manhattan sidewalks at 8 in the evening weren't exactly dangerous, especially not near a building with security in the lobby. But something about the simple honesty in his answer made her decide not to argue. They walked out together, talking easily about nothing important, the same comfortable rhythm they'd built back in Millbrook, carrying over seamlessly into the city. As the weeks passed, Brielle noticed something shifting in how she thought about him. The rumors she'd heard about his business, the whispered warnings from acquaintances who claimed his family had connections to dangerous people, started to feel distant and disconnected from the man she actually knew. The Grayson she'd come to recognize was patient, thoughtful, quick to listen, and slow to judge. He remembered small details about her life without needing to be reminded twice. He treated her ambitions with the same seriousness he gave to million-dollar business deals. She caught herself, more than once, looking forward to the gala meetings, not just for the work itself, but for the quiet moments before and after, when it was just the two of them, talking about anything but seating arrangements or catering menus. One afternoon, while reviewing final logistics with her small planning team, one of her assistants mentioned offhand how unusual it was that someone as busy and guarded as Grayson Hale had attended nearly every single meeting personally instead of sending a representative like most of the other sponsors did. Brielle laughed it off at the time, brushing the comment aside with something about him simply being thorough. But that night, lying awake in her apartment, she found herself replaying the observation with a little more honesty than she'd allowed herself during the day. She wasn't sure yet what it meant, this steady presence he'd become in her life over the past several weeks. She only knew that somewhere between the farmer's market in Millbrook and the conference room overlooking Central Park, Grayson Hale had stopped being the intimidating stranger from that humiliating night and had become someone she genuinely looked forward to seeing. What she didn't yet know was how much more complicated that feeling was about to become once the truth about exactly who he was finally caught up with her. The truth found Brielle in the most ordinary way possible, tucked inside a conversation she wasn't even meant to overhear. She'd stayed late at the Foundation's office one evening, finishing invoice approvals for the caterers, when two board members walked past the open door of the small side room she was working in. They didn't notice her sitting there behind the half-closed partition, laptop glowing in the dim light. "I still can't believe they let Hale sponsor this thing," one of them muttered, voice low, but not low enough. "Man's family basically runs half the ports on the East Coast. Everyone knows what that really means." "As long as the check clears," the other replied with a short laugh. "Foundation doesn't ask where the money comes from. Never has." "Just seems reckless, associating the gala with someone that deep into that world, if even half of what people say about the Hale family is true." Their voices faded as they moved further down the hallway, leaving Brielle sitting frozen at her desk, the invoice numbers on her screen suddenly meaningless. She'd heard whispers before, vague and distant, the kind of gossip people mentioned about any sufficiently wealthy family without much thought behind it. She'd assumed exaggeration, assumed rumor inflated by jealousy or fear of anyone with that much money and influence. She hadn't let herself actually consider it might be true. Not about someone she'd spent weeks getting to know, someone who'd walked her to her car and listened to her talk about flower arrangements like it was the most interesting subject in the world. She went home that night and searched his name for the first time since they'd started spending time together. She'd avoided doing it before, telling herself it didn't matter, that whatever reputation followed him wasn't necessarily the truth. Now, scrolling through old articles and half-verified reports, she found more than she expected. Nothing overtly proven, nothing that named him directly in anything criminal, but enough speculation, enough mentions of his family's name alongside words like organized crime and federal investigation that her stomach turned uneasy. She avoided him for the next 4 days, canceling one planning meeting under the excuse of a scheduling conflict and sending brief, professional emails instead of the easy conversations they'd grown used to having in person. Grayson noticed immediately. He didn't call her repeatedly or show up uninvited at her office demanding an explanation, though the thought crossed his mind more than once. Instead, he waited, giving her the space she seemed to need, even as the silence between them felt heavier than he expected it to. On the fifth day, she finally agreed to a brief meeting to finalize the seating chart, choosing a public coffee shop instead of the usual conference room. She kept her tone clipped and professional throughout, avoiding the easy warmth that had defined their conversations for weeks. Grayson noticed that too. "You've been distant," he said eventually, setting down his cup. "I'd rather you just tell me why than keep guessing." Brielle hesitated, weighing whether to voice the question that had been sitting heavy in her chest for days. Finally, she decided honesty mattered more than comfort. "I overheard something at the office," she said carefully, "about your family, about what people say you're really involved in." She watched his face for any flicker of surprise or defensiveness. There was none. He simply nodded slowly, like he'd been expecting this conversation for longer than she realized. "I won't insult you by pretending I don't know what you heard," he said. "The rumors aren't entirely wrong, Brielle. My family's business has ties to things that most people would consider dangerous. I've spent most of my life keeping that world separate from people who don't need to be part of it." Her chest tightened. Part of her had hoped he would deny it outright, offer some simple explanation that made all of it disappear. Instead, he gave her the truth plainly, without excuses or attempts to soften it. "I understand if that changes things for you," he continued, his voice steady, without a trace of pressure or persuasion. "You don't owe me anything, and you're free to walk away from all of this if that's what feels right. I won't chase you down or try to convince you otherwise. That's never been who I am." His calm honesty unsettled her more than any denial could have. She'd braced herself for manipulation, for charm deployed to smooth over the truth. Instead, he simply let the weight of his own words sit between them, giving her complete control over what happened next. She left the coffee shop that day without a clear answer, her mind spinning through everything she thought she knew about him versus everything she'd just learned. Over the following days, Brielle found herself replaying every interaction they'd had since Millbrook. The patience he'd shown at the farmer's market, the way he'd genuinely listened to her ideas about the gala instead of just writing checks and walking away. The night he'd waited to make sure she got to her car safely, expecting nothing in return. None of it matched the frightening image the rumors painted. If he'd wanted to use his power to control or manipulate her, he'd had countless opportunities already, and he'd never taken a single one of them. She thought about how he'd told her the truth without flinching, without minimizing it, or trying to talk her out of her fear. Most people lied about far smaller things to protect themselves. He hadn't. Slowly, cautiously, she began separating the man she'd actually experienced from the reputation that followed his family name. It didn't erase her concerns entirely, but it shifted something in how she chose to see him, moving her further from judging him by whispered rumors and closer to judging him by the version of himself he'd actually shown her. By the time the gala's final preparations arrived, Brielle had made a quiet decision she hadn't fully voiced yet, even to herself. Whatever complications came with knowing him, she wasn't ready to walk away from what they'd built, simply because of what other people assumed about his world. She just didn't yet know how much that decision would be tested once the gala finally began. The night of the gala arrived with a kind of energy that only comes once a year in Manhattan's charity circuit. The ballroom at the Whitmore Hotel had been transformed exactly as Brielle envisioned. Soft, gold lighting draped across the ceiling, tables arranged to highlight the foundation's community photographs rather than hide them behind floral centerpieces. Every detail carried her fingerprint, from the program order to the specific shade of candlelight chosen for each table. She arrived 3 hours early, moving through the space with a checklist in hand, coordinating with vendors and double-checking the sound system before a single guest walked through the door. For the first time in weeks, nerves about Grayson took a back seat to the more familiar nerves of making sure an event ran without a single mistake. By 7 o'clock, the ballroom filled with donors, business leaders, and a handful of minor celebrities who lent extra shine to the evening's press coverage. Brielle stayed mostly behind the scenes, checking in with servers, adjusting the timing of speeches, and making sure the evening's program flowed smoothly from one moment to the next. She spotted Grayson near the entrance shortly after the doors opened, dressed sharply, greeting other sponsors with the same measured calm she'd come to recognize as entirely his own. Their eyes met briefly across the room. He gave her a small, private nod, not the polite acknowledgement reserved for professional colleagues, but something warmer, something meant only for her. The evening moved along smoothly until Brielle overheard a cluster of guests near the bar, their voices pitched just low enough to seem private, though not low enough to stay unheard. "Can't believe she's running this whole thing," one woman said, glancing toward Brielle across the room. "After what happened at that engagement party, I thought she'd disappear from the scene entirely." "I heard he humiliated her in front of everyone," another added. "Honestly, can't blame him for reacting that way, given her size and all. Surprised she's still putting herself out there like this." The words landed the same way they had at the engagement party, quiet but sharp, chipping away at the confidence she'd spent weeks rebuilding. Brielle kept walking, refusing to let her expression shift, though her chest tightened with the familiar sting of being reduced to her appearance rather than her work. She didn't confront them. She didn't need to. Instead, she focused on the task in front of her, checking the timeline for the evening's speeches, making sure the Foundation's director had her notes ready, and confirming the final logistics before the program began. When the formal speeches began, Brielle stood near the side of the stage, coordinating the transitions between speakers. Diane Coker spoke first, thanking donors and outlining the Foundation's achievements over the past year. A handful of major sponsors followed, most offering brief, polished remarks about the importance of giving back. Then Grayson stepped up to the podium. Brielle hadn't expected him to speak at length. Most sponsors kept their remarks short, more interested in being seen than in saying anything meaningful. But Grayson spoke with a steadiness that pulled the room's attention immediately. "I've sponsored a lot of events over the years," he began, "but I don't think I've seen one organized with this level of care and precision." He paused, scanning the room briefly before continuing. "Every detail tonight, from the photographs on your tables to the timing of this very speech, was handled by one person."
Brielle Anders.
A murmur rippled through the crowd, some guests turning to search for her near the stage. "I've had the chance to watch her work closely these past several weeks," he continued, his voice calm but carrying real weight. "And I can tell you the success of tonight isn't luck or good timing. It's the result of someone who takes her work seriously, who cares about getting every detail right, and who deserves far more credit than she usually receives for it." He looked directly at Brielle as he said it, not with the practiced charm of someone performing for an audience, but with the plain sincerity of someone who meant every word. "I'd like everyone here tonight to remember her name, and to remember that the real success behind an evening like this rarely belongs to the people writing checks. It belongs to the person who turns those checks into something meaningful." The applause that followed felt different from the polite claps that greeted the earlier speeches. It was louder, more genuine, guests turning toward Brielle with expressions that had shifted noticeably from the whispered judgment she'd overheard earlier in the evening. Brielle stood frozen for a moment, unsure how to respond to the sudden shift in the room's attention. The same women who had gossiped about her appearance near the bar now offered her small, approving nods as she made her way through the crowd afterward. Several guests stopped her personally to compliment the evening's execution, praising details they hadn't bothered to notice before Grayson's speech gave them a reason to look closer. For the first time since the engagement party, she felt seen for something other than her size or the humiliation that had followed her these past weeks. It wasn't pity driving the compliments now, And it wasn't the awkward sympathy she'd grown used to bracing herself for. It was recognition, plain and simple, for work she'd poured herself into completely. Later that evening, as the crowd began thinning and cleanup started behind the scenes, Grayson found her near the coat check, the two of them finally alone for the first time since the speeches ended. "You didn't have to do that," she said quietly. "I know," he said. "I wanted to." She studied his face, searching for any hint of performance behind the gesture, any trace of doing it for attention or personal gain. She found none. "Thank you," she said finally, meaning it more deeply than the simple words conveyed. He nodded once, offering nothing more than a small, genuine smile before helping her gather the last of the event materials. Neither of them spoke about what this moment meant for whatever was growing between them. But standing there together, long after most of the guests had gone home, Brielle understood clearly for the first time that Grayson Hale had chosen, publicly and without hesitation, to stand entirely on her side. What she still didn't know was exactly how long he'd been standing there quietly, long before tonight ever gave him the chance to prove it. 3 days after the gala, Brielle found herself back at the Foundation's office, wrapping up final paperwork and thank you notes to sponsors. She was surprised when Delaney appeared at the front desk, asking if she had a few minutes to spare. She'd met him briefly before, always in passing during gala preparations, exchanging little more than polite greetings whenever he accompanied Grayson to meetings. He seemed different today, more relaxed, carrying himself without the usual formality that came with representing his employer. "Grayson doesn't know I'm here," he admitted once they'd settled into the small office lounge, 2 cups of coffee between them. "I wanted to talk to you myself, if that's all right." Brielle nodded, curiosity outweighing any hesitation. "I've worked for him almost 8 years now," Delaney began. "Long enough to know when something matters to him and when it doesn't."
And I think you should know a few things he probably won't tell you himself. He explained that Grayson had first noticed her well over a year earlier, during a charity fundraiser. Delaney remembered the event clearly, mostly because Grayson had stayed far longer than he needed to, watching from a distance as Brielle worked the room with an ease and warmth that seemed to put everyone around her instantly at ease. "There was a kid there that night," Delaney continued. "Spilled juice all over his shirt right before pictures were supposed to start, on the verge of tears in front of everyone." He paused, watching Brielle's expression shift as the memory surfaced in her own mind. "You crouched right down next to him, gave him your jacket to wear over the stain, told him it made him look like some kind of secret agent, had him laughing within about 10 seconds. Brielle remembered the moment vaguely, one of hundreds of small interactions she'd had over the years managing events, never realizing anyone beyond the child himself had paid much attention to it. "Grayson saw the whole thing," Delaney said. "Told me afterward it was the first time in a long time he'd seen someone care that much about a stranger's feelings without needing an audience to notice." He went on to explain how Grayson had asked about her occasionally after that night. Nothing invasive, just quiet curiosity about the woman who organized charity events with that kind of genuine warmth. He'd learned her name, followed her career from a distance, admired the way she built her reputation entirely on skill and kindness rather than connections or status. "He never approached you, though," Delaney said. "Believe me, I asked him why more than once. He always gave the same answer. Said someone like you deserved a life untouched by everything that comes with knowing someone like him. Said the risks weren't fair to ask you to carry, especially when you hadn't done anything to deserve being pulled into that world." Brielle sat quietly, processing everything Delaney had shared. The engagement party, the humiliation, the months of what she'd assumed were simple coincidences in Millbrook, all of it reshaping itself in her mind with this new understanding of how long Grayson had actually been paying attention. "Why tell me now?" she asked finally. Delaney considered the question carefully before answering. "Because I've never seen him let himself get close to anyone the way he has with you these past few months. And I think he's too stubborn to ever tell you the full truth himself, worried it'll scare you off before you've had the chance to actually understand it." He offered a small, genuine smile. "Figured you deserved to know the truth wasn't built on pity or timing or anything convenient.
It was built a long time before that party ever happened. Brielle left the office that afternoon with her mind spinning through months of memories now recontextualized by everything Delaney had told her. The farmer's market encounter she'd assumed was pure coincidence. The cafe recommendation he'd casually mentioned, one he admitted he'd visited only once before, years earlier, likely around the same time he'd first started noticing her at charity events. The bookstore, the botanical garden, the careful way he'd never pushed for anything beyond friendship until she was ready. None of it had been random. None of it had been convenient timing or lucky coincidence. It had been patience, deliberate and quiet, built on genuine respect for who she was, rather than pity for what had happened to her. She thought about the engagement party again, about the moment Marcus's cruel words had echoed across that ballroom. She'd always assumed Grayson's attention afterward came from witnessing her humiliation, some instinct to comfort someone he'd seen hurt in public. Now she understood the truth ran far deeper than that single moment. He'd already admired her long before Marcus ever opened his mouth that night. The humiliation hadn't created his interest. It had simply given him the reason he needed to finally act on feelings he'd carried quietly for over a year. That evening, sitting alone in her apartment, Brielle found herself smiling at nothing in particular, replaying every small gesture from these past months with entirely new eyes. The patience made sense now. The careful distance during their early meetings made sense now. Even his calm honesty about his family's business, offered without excuses or pressure, made sense as the actions of someone who valued her enough to give her the whole truth, rather than a comfortable lie. She picked up her phone and typed a short message to Grayson, simple and direct, asking if he'd be free to talk sometime soon. She didn't mention what Delaney had told her. Not yet. Some conversations deserved to happen in person, face to face, without the distance of a screen between them. As she set her phone down and looked out over the city lights outside her window, she realized the humiliating night at that engagement party, the worst moment of her recent memory, had somehow become the beginning of something she never expected to find. Something built not on pity or convenient timing, but on a kind of quiet respect she hadn't known she was missing until Grayson Hale had shown her exactly what it looked like. 3 weeks after the gala, Brielle stood in the ballroom of a historic Boston hotel, overseeing the final details. It was smaller than the New York gala, more intimate, but she'd poured just as much care into every detail, from the color of the table linens to the timing of each speech. Grayson attended as a supporter, not a sponsor this time, choosing to stay quietly in the background the way he always did when the evening belonged to her work, rather than to whatever was growing between them. Their relationship over the past few weeks had settled into something steady and unhurried, built on long phone calls, quiet dinners away from public attention, and the kind of trust that came from choosing honesty, even when it would have been easier not to. The event was nearly finished, guests beginning to filter toward the exits, when Brielle spotted a familiar face near the bar that made her stomach drop unexpectedly. Marcus. She hadn't seen him since the engagement party, hadn't heard much beyond a vague mention from a mutual friend that his engagement to Elena had quietly ended a few months earlier. He looked different somehow, less polished than she remembered, and he seemed to notice her at nearly the same moment she noticed him. He approached her carefully, glancing around the room like he wasn't entirely sure of his welcome. Brielle. His voice carried none of the mocking edge from that night, replaced instead by something quieter, almost hesitant. I saw your name on the event program. I didn't expect you to still be doing this kind of work after everything. Why wouldn't I be? She asked evenly, refusing to let old discomfort creep back into her voice. He shifted, clearly uncomfortable. I heard about what happened at your event in New York. The speech that businessman gave about you. Half the city's been talking about it. He paused, seeming to choose his next words carefully. I wanted to say I'm sorry for what I said that night. I was drunk and insecure, and I took it out on you in front of everyone. It wasn't fair. Brielle studied him for a long moment, waiting to feel the familiar sting of humiliation resurface. It didn't come. Instead, she felt something closer to distance, like she was looking at a memory that no longer had power over her. "I appreciate you saying that," she said honestly. "But I stopped needing your apology a while ago, Marcus.
I figured out on my own that what you said that night was never really about me." He nodded slowly, something like regret crossing his face before he offered a final awkward smile and stepped away, disappearing back into the thinning crowd. Brielle watched him go, surprised by how little the encounter actually affected her. The humiliation that once defined one of the worst nights of her life had lost its grip entirely, replaced by a version of herself who no longer needed anyone's apology to feel whole. After the event wound down and the last guests had left, Grayson found her near the coat check, exactly as he had after the New York gala weeks earlier. "You all right?" he asked, having noticed the brief exchange with Marcus from across the room. "I'm better than all right," she said, and meant it completely. They left the hotel together and walked toward the harbor, the evening air cool and carrying the faint smell of salt water. The city lights reflected off the dark surface of the water, and for a while, neither of them spoke, content simply to walk side by side in comfortable silence. "I've been thinking about that night at the engagement party," Grayson said eventually, breaking the quiet. "I never told you the full reason I couldn't stop thinking about it afterward." Brielle glanced at him, curious. "I'd admired you for over a year before that party," he continued, echoing what Delaney had already told her, but hearing it directly from him carried a different weight entirely. "I told myself keeping my distance was protecting you from my world, but watching him humiliate you in front of everyone, watching you walk out with your head held high anyway, I realized staying silent wasn't protecting anyone. It was just costing me the chance to know someone I already respected more than I'd let myself admit." Brielle stopped walking, turning to face him fully. "I spent weeks after that engagement party feeling like less of myself because of what he said. But everything that happened after, Millbrook, the gala, all of it, made me realize I don't need someone who only sees my appearance to define how I feel about myself." "You deserve someone who sees more than that," Grayson said quietly. "I know," she said, smiling. "I found him." He reached for her hand, the gesture simple but deliberate, and she let him take it without hesitation, the two of them continuing their walk along the harbor as the city hummed quietly around them. "I'm not going to pretend my world doesn't come with complications," Grayson said after a while. "There will be risks, things I can't always control or explain." "I've had months to think about that," Brielle replied. "I'd rather face those complications with someone honest than spend my life with someone who only wanted the version of me that looked good standing next to him." They stopped near the edge of the harbor, the water calm beneath the night sky, and Grayson turned to face her fully. "I should have approached you a long time ago," he admitted. "I let my own fear decide what you deserved instead of asking you directly." "You're asking now," she said softly. "That's what matters." He smiled, something warm and unguarded crossing his features, and for the first time since she'd known him, he looked completely at ease, free of whatever careful calculation usually shaped his expressions in public. They stood together at the harbor's edge for a long while, the painful memory of that humiliating engagement party finally settling into something distant and powerless, transformed instead into the unlikely beginning of everything that followed. Brielle understood now that the worst night of her life hadn't broken her, and it certainly hadn't defined her. Instead, it had led her, step by unexpected step, straight into the arms of someone who saw every part of her clearly and chose her anyway, complications and all. And as they turned to walk back toward the city lights together, neither of them needed any further words to understand that whatever came next, they would face it side by side.